Oh, there he is. That's the covert action link, article link. Here it is, boys.
Unfolding situation in Afghanistan.
Let's watch what he has to say.
The developments that have taken place in the last week and the steps we're taking to address the rapidly evolving events. My national security team and I have been closely monitoring the situation on the ground in Afghanistan and moving quickly to execute the plans we had put in place to respond to every constituency, including and contingency, including the rapid collapse we're seeing now. I'll speak more in a moment about the specific steps we're taking, but I want to remind everyone how we got here and what America's interests are in Afghanistan. We went to Afghanistan almost 20 years ago with clear goals. Get those who attacked us on September 11, 2001, and make sure al-Qaeda could not use Afghanistan as a base from which to attack us again. We did that. We severely degraded al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. We never gave up the hunt for Osama bin Laden, and we got him. That was a decade ago. Our mission in Afghanistan was never supposed to have been nation building. It was never supposed to be creating a unified, centralized democracy. Our only vital national interest in Afghanistan remains today what it has always been: preventing a terrorist attack on America's homeland. I've argued for many years that our mission should be narrowly focused on counterterrorism, not counterinsurgency or nation building. That's why I opposed the surge when it was proposed in 2009 when I was vice president. And that's why, as president, I'm adamant that we focus on the threats we face today in 2021, not yesterday's threats. Today, the terrorist threat has metastasized well beyond Afghanistan. Al-Shabaab in Somalia, al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, al-Nusra in Syria, ISIS attempting to create a caliphate in Syria and Iraq, and establishing affiliates in multiple countries in Africa and Asia. These threats warrant our attention and our resources. We conduct effective counterterrorism missions against terrorist groups in multiple countries where we don't have permanent military presence. If necessary, we'll do the same in Afghanistan. We've developed counterterrorism over-the-horizon capability that will allow us to keep our eyes firmly fixed on the direct threats to the United States and the region, and act quickly and decisively if needed. When I came into office, I inherited a deal that President Trump negotiated with the Taliban. Under his agreement, U.S. forces would be out of Afghanistan by May 1, 2021, just a little over 3 months after I took office. U.S. forces had already drawn down during the Trump administration from roughly 15,500 American forces to 2,500 troops in country. And the Taliban was at its strongest militarily since 2001. The choice I had to make as your president was either to follow through on that agreement or be prepared to go back to fighting the Taliban in the middle of the spring fighting season. There would have been no ceasefire after May 1. There was no agreement protecting our forces after May 1. There was no status quo of stability without American casualties after May 1.
Why 7 months?
There was only a cold reality of either following through on the agreement to withdraw our forces or escalating the conflict and sending thousands more American troops back into combat in Afghanistan, lurching into the third decade of conflict. I stand squarely behind my decision. After 20 years, I've learned the hard way that there was never a good time to withdraw U.S. forces. That's why we're still there. We were clear-eyed about the risk.
1 year.
We planned for every contingency, but I always promised the American people that I would be straight with you. The truth is, this did unfold more quickly than we had anticipated.
May 1.
Yeah.
So what's happened?
They said 6 months.
Afghanistan
It took
political leaders
72
gave up
hours, motherfucker.
and fled the country. The Afghan military collapsed, sometime without trying to fight. If anything, the developments of the past week reinforced that ending U.S. military involvement in Afghanistan now was the right decision. American troops cannot and should not be fighting in a war and dying in a war that Afghan forces are not willing to fight for themselves. We spent over $1 trillion. We trained and equipped an Afghan military force with some
We overlooked child rape.
300,000 strong.
We even let him do
Incredibly well
child rape, Jack.
A force larger in size than the militaries of many of our NATO
True.
allies. We gave them every tool they could need. We paid their salaries, provided for the maintenance of their Air Force, something the Taliban doesn't have. Taliban does not have an Air Force. We provided close air
They have
support.
Black Hawk helicopters now.
We gave them every chance to determine their own future. What we could not provide them was the will to fight for that future.
They do have one now.
Some very brave and capable Afghan special forces units and soldiers.
Our baby is doing well.
But if Afghanistan is unable to mount any real resistance to the Taliban now, there is no chance that 1 year, 1 more year, 5 more years,
He's right.
or 20 more years,
He's literally right.
U.S. military boots on the ground would have made any difference.
All jokes aside, he's right.
Here's what I believe.
It's
To my
100%
core.
true.
It is wrong to order American troops to step up when Afghanistan's own armed forces would not. The political leaders of Afghanistan were unable to come together for the good of their people, unable to negotiate for the future of their country when the chips were down. They would never have done so while U.S. troops remained in Afghanistan, bearing the brunt of the fighting for them. And our true strategic competitors, China and Russia, would love nothing more than the
I like
United
that he's
States to
shifting the
continue to
blame
funnel
onto the Afghan
billions
people,
of
by the
dollars
way,
in resources
and not like
attention into
what we've done for
stabilizing
20 years
Afghanistan
being just
indefinitely.
dumb as fuck. Like he
When I hosted
briefly
President
alludes
Ghani
to
and
our
Chairman
involvement,
Abdullah at the White House in June,
but he's like, yeah, these
and again
Afghans,
when
they
I
don't want to
spoke
be
by
liberated,
phone
Jack.
to Ghani in July, we had very frank conversations.
Hello, Hassan. I love your
We
pretty
talked
face.
about how
Thanks for 7
Afghanistan
months.
should prepare to fight their civil wars after the U.S. military departed, to clean up the corruption in government so the government could
Hey, Jack,
function
you've had a good day
for
so
the
far.
Afghan people.
Hassle.
We talked extensively about the need for Afghan leaders to unite politically. They fail to do any of that. I also urge them to engage in
8
diplomacy,
months, let's go hassle.
to seek a political settlement with the Taliban. This advice was flatly refused. Mr. Ghani insisted the Afghan forces would fight, but obviously he was wrong.
He's like, they lied to us.
So I'm left again to ask of those who argue that we should stay. How many more generations of America's daughters and sons would you have me send to fight Afghanistan's civil war
He's right.
when
He's
Afghan
right.
troops will not? How many more lives, American lives, is it worth? How many endless rows of headstones at Arlington National Cemetery? I'm clear on my answer. I will not repeat the mistakes we've made in the past. Mistake of staying and fighting indefinitely in a conflict that is not in the national interest of the United Forces. Those are the mistakes we cannot continue to repeat because we have significant vital interest in the world that we cannot afford to
We're
ignore.
too focused on doing the same in Cuba, Jack.
I also want to acknowledge how painful this is to so many of us. The scenes we're seeing in Afghanistan, they're gut-wrenching, particularly for our veterans, our diplomats, humanitarian workers, for anyone who has spent time on the ground working to support the Afghan people, for those who have lost loved ones in Afghanistan, and for Americans who have fought and served in the country serve our country in Afghanistan. This is deeply, deeply personal. It is for me as well. I've worked on these issues as long as anyone. I've been throughout Afghanistan during this war, while the war was going on, from Kabul to Kandahar to the Kunar Valley. I've traveled there on 4 different occasions. I met with the people. I've spoken to the leaders. I spent time with our troops. And I came to understand firsthand what was and was not possible in Afghanistan. So now we're focused on what is possible. We will continue to support the Afghan people.
Thanks for this dream.
We will lead with our diplomacy, our international influence, and our humanitarian aid. We'll continue to push for regional diplomacy and engagement to prevent violence and instability. We'll continue to speak out for the basic rights of the Afghan people, of women and girls, just as we speak out all over the world. I've been clear that human rights must be the center of our foreign policy, not the periphery. But the way to do it is not through endless military deployments. It's with our diplomacy, our economic tools, and rallying the world to join us. Now, let me lay out the current mission in Afghanistan. I was asked to authorize, and I did, 6,000 U.S. troops to deploy to Afghanistan for the purpose of assisting in the departure of U.S. and allied civilian personnel from Afghanistan, and to evacuate our Afghan allies and vulnerable Afghans to safety outside of Afghanistan. Our troops are working to secure the airfield and to ensure continued operation of both the civilian and military flights. We're taking over air traffic control. We have safely shut down our embassy and transferred our diplomats. Our diplomatic presence is now consolidated at the airport as well. Over the coming days, we intend to transport out thousands of American citizens who have been living and working in Afghanistan. We'll also continue to support the safe departure
What about the
of civilian
McDonald's in Kabul, Jack?
the civilian personnel of our allies who are still serving in Afghanistan.
This is going to be so bad
Operation
for his approval
Allies
rating.
Refugee, which I announced back in July, has already moved 2,000 Afghans who are eligible for special immigration visas and their families to the United States. In the coming days, the U.S. military will provide assistance to move more SIV-eligible Afghans and their families out of Afghanistan. We're also expanding refugee access to cover other vulnerable Afghans who worked for our embassy, U.S. non-governmental agencies, or U.S. non-governmental organizations, and Afghans who otherwise are at great risk, in U.S. news agencies. I know there are concerns about why we did not begin evacuating Afghans, civilians sooner. Part of the answer is some of the Afghans did not want to leave earlier, still hopeful for their country. And part of it because the Afghan government and its supporters discouraged us from organizing a mass exodus to avoid triggering, as they said, a crisis of confidence. American troops are performing this mission as professionally and as effectively as they always do, but it is not without risks. As we carry out this departure, we have made it clear to the Taliban, if they attack our personnel or disrupt our operation, the U.S. presence will be swift and the response will be swift and forceful. We will defend our people with devastating force if necessary. Our current military mission will be short in time, limited in scope, and focused in its objectives. Get our people and our allies as safely as quickly as possible. And once we have completed this mission,
What about the
we will
refugees,
conclude
bro?
our military withdrawal. We will end America's longest war after 20 long years of bloodshed. The events we're seeing now are sadly proof that no amount of military force would ever deliver a
Send
stable,
someone at my school
united,
bookstore thought I was
secure
Turkish.
Afghanistan, as known in history as the graveyard of empires.
Say inshallah.
What's happening now could just as easily happen 5 years ago
Yo.
or 15 years in the future. You have to be honest. Our mission in Afghanistan is taking many missteps, made many missteps over the past 2 decades. I'm now the 4th American president to preside over war in Afghanistan. 2 Democrats and 2 Republicans. I will not pass this responsibility on to a 5th president. I will not mislead the American people by claiming that just a little more time in Afghanistan will make all the difference. Nor will I shrink from my share of responsibility for where we are today and how we must move forward from here. I am President of the United States of America, and the buck stops with me. I'm deeply saddened by the facts we now face, but I do not regret my decision to end America's war fighting in Afghanistan and maintain a laser focus on our counterterrorism missions there and other parts of the world. Our mission to degrade the terrorist threat of al-Qaeda in Afghanistan and kill Osama bin Laden was a success. Our decades-long effort to overcome centuries of history and permanently change and remake Afghanistan was not, and I wrote and believed it never could be. I cannot and will not ask our troops to fight on endlessly in another country's civil war, taking casualties, suffering life-shattering injuries, leaving families broken by grief and loss. This is not in our national security interest.
Why does Joe look
It
like
is
he's
not what the American people want. It is not what our troops, who have sacrificed so much over the past 2 decades, deserve. I made a commitment to the American people when I ran for president that I would bring America's military involvement in Afghanistan to an end.
This is really interesting.
While it's
I
been
never thought I
hard
would
and
see
messy,
a president in my lifetime
and
do this.
yes, far from perfect. I've honored
Like
that commitment.
overall,
More importantly, I made a commitment to the brave men and women who
Respect.
serve this nation that I wasn't going to ask them to continue to risk their lives in a military action that should have ended long ago.
My balls are sweaty.
Our leaders did that in Vietnam when I got here as a young man. I will not do it in Afghanistan. I know my decision will be criticized, but I would rather take all that criticism than pass this decision on to another president of the United States, yet another one, a 5th one, because it's the right one, it's the right decision for our
8
people,
months, let's go.
the right one for our brave service members who risk their lives serving our nation, and it's the right one for America. Thank you. May God protect our troops, our
9
diplomats,
months if I had been
and
conceived
all
when I
brave
first said
Americans
I would
serving
be
in
your
harm's way.
stable.
that was very interesting. That was remarkable. That is not something that you often see from an American president, which is functionally just a puppet for the military-industrial complex's decisions.
Comes less than 30 days before the nation marks
I mean, that's he just basically was like, yeah, we're fucking pulling out. We're pulling out, Jack.
Let's start with
Love
James
me some
Hellman.
Sleepy
James
Joe.
has seemed to double down on what he's been saying all
That's
summer long.
it's
that
it. No
he
ifs, ands, or
is going
buts.
to get
That's
the
what
US
you.
out of Afghanistan. That he
That's what you want to
will be
hear.
Sending those additional troops to evacuate our allies and other Americans who are there. But that's where it stops. So what is your
Oscord
takeaway
Malding,
from what you
why?
heard?
Well, Rhonda, my takeaway is that was a very
I don't know what the
aggressive,
messaging is going to look like for now. Now, the reason why I don't know what the message is going to look like is because, like, he basically stood tall and literally said, like, yeah, we're fucking pulling out, and it's the correct thing to do, and they're right, and he is right. It is the correct thing to do. I'm not continuing the fucking 20 years of devastation that we caused there. Obviously, he didn't take ownership of the previous instability that that the American forces that the American forces basically created in the region, but he was never going to do that. Wasn't Trump saying that the whole time? Yes, and I literally said that Trump pulling out of Afghanistan was good.
Which is, a massive change from kind of where George W.
So I don't know what you guys want from me. I think that it was correct when the Trump administration wanted to do this, and I still think it's correct when the Biden administration is going forward with doing this. So on that note, one, I have to run an hourly ad because I forgot to run it at 1, so I apologize. And I'm going to move on to having Mike Preisner on. And before I do that, I'm going to introduce to you who my guest is. My next guest is I just want to show you one of his videos that I've watched on here many times. I'm just going to do a 1-minute ad here. If you want an ad-free broadcasting experience, you already know the deal. You can subscribe. He's a veteran. Mike Preisner is an American political activist. He is a U.S. Army veteran who served in Iraq as a corporal, and he has taken a really strong stance. He's a communist. He's fucking awesome. I'm really excited to have him on, and you'll know exactly why once I show you this video, this very famous video of his.
To Democrats, I was looking at them. It was basically an outline
where I'll just fucking show it to you. Here it is.
Sticking to that script, he's not backing down. He emphasized the troops that are being deployed to help get Americans.
I think this is the actual video, right? Yeah, that is the video.
For a very focused mission, he does not.
Hold on, let me fucking turn this off. All right, this is the guest I'm about to have. His name is Mike Preisner, and you've probably seen this video maybe in the past, but you'll understand why I want to have him on. Here it is. And I'm going to run the ad now, too. If you no longer want to see the ads, you can subscribe. If you have a Twitch Prime, it's free. You can subscribe for $5. You can fucking use an ad block or a VPN. But here's the 1-minute ad break now. But that's how you get an ad-free broadcasting experience. Twitch Prime is free if you literally have it. Here's the 1-minute ad break now. Here's the video. I just want to show you this before I have him on.
Susan Brothers, thanks everyone for being here. We're from the organization March Forward. We are here to say to all those serving in the Army and the Marines and the Air Force and the Navy that you have the absolute right to refuse to take part in these criminal wars, and that's a right that all of you should exercise. You have no reason to go put your life on the line and kill and die for profit. We've been to Iraq. We've been to Afghanistan. And we know what these wars are really about. And we joined the military for many reasons. Because we need a college education, because we need a job, because we need health care. And then we join the military, and they tell us that our enemies are poor people in caves in Afghanistan, or poor people in the deserts of Iraq. But we've been to those countries, and we know that our enemies are not other poor people abroad. Our enemies are the people that laid us off from our jobs, that denied us health care, that make it impossible to get an education. Our enemies are not in the poorest countries on the planet, but right here in the richest one. The occupations of Iraq and Afghanistan alone are costing over $700 million every single day. This is a crime every single day, while so many of us are hurting. Well, I think all of us here and the vast majority of people in this country would agree that we can spend $700 million a day better than bombing people that we have no reason to bomb. We can spend $700 million a day rebuilding those countries we've destroyed. We can spend $700 million a day caring for the veterans we get home when they get home, and then we can spend $700 million a day giving every single person health care, a college education, a job, and a livelihood, and a home. That's who we need to be spending our money on. But this government is not going to do that. They're not going to use the money in that way. They're not going to end the wars. And they're not going to do it because it's not our government. It's their government. It's the government of the rich. It's the government of Wall Street, of the oil giants, of the defense contractors. It's their government, and the only language that they understand is shutting down business as usual. And that's what we're doing here today, and we're going to continue to do until these wars are over. It's crystal clear now that these wars are going to continue and expand and go into other countries. That is the trend. That is what we know, that there is perpetual war, and it's only going to stop if the people stand up and stop it. And that's what we're going to do, sisters and brothers. A lot of people ask me, what do we do? Because we all know things are bad. We all see the atrocities on TV. We read about it. We experience it. People always ask, what do I do? Because we always want to know what to do. Do we vote? Do we support a politician? Do we join an organization? What do we do? Well, I'll tell you what we do. It's simple. We fight. We fight and we fight and we fight and we shut down our workplaces. We shut down our schools. We shut down the streets. We shut down business as usual. And we fight until we force the people in there to do what the people out here want. Because that's how we're going to get around, and we're going to fight until there's not one more bomb drop, not one more bullet fired, not one more soldier coming home in a wheelchair, not one more family slaughtered, not one more day of U.S. imperialism. So let's fight to make that happen. We can do it today, and in the days ahead, we have to fight to end these wars and create a better world system, brothers.
All right. That is Mike. I hope I don't know if I'm fucking up Mike's last name here. Mike Preisner, who is joining me right now. Hey, what's going on, man?
Hey, what's up, Hassan?
All right, I can hear you. Let me just like adjust your volume. Damn, your setup is fucking actually very serious right now.
I'm in the Empire File studio.
Oh hell yeah! You wanna get a little bit closer to the microphone? Just while I work on this stuff real quick. Okay, let's put it into studio mode. Boom. There it is. Okay. Okay. All right, perfect. Let me just like turn this up and turn you and show you to the people here. I know I just gassed you up super hard by showing your awesome video, and then immediately after that, I'm like doing technical stuff. But here he is, folks. Am I saying your last name right, by the way? Is it Preisner or Prisner?
Preisner, you did it right, man.
Oh, Preisner. Okay, perfect. Mike, do you want to give a little bit of a background on yourself? I mean, you're a filmmaker. You are a producer and writer for the Empire Files. Or the co-host of the Eyes Left Pod.
Sure, yeah. I mean, I guess my qualification to talk about this topic, I'm a producer of the show called The Empire Files, which you can find on YouTube. I made a film with my partner, Abby Martin, called Gaza Fights for Freedom. But, I've been a kind of journalist on the issue of Afghanistan for a long time. In fact, the first article I ever published back in 2008 was about the Afghanistan war, and I've done media work ever since. The Empire Files done a few documentaries about the Afghanistan war. But I think more so my involvement has been as a veteran. I mean, someone in my, I went to the Iraq War. I was in the Army when 9/11 happened. I had joined like 1 month before the 9/11 attacks. And so I kind of witnessed the 9/11 transformation, while I was still in training. But, all of my, even though I just went to Iraq for a year, all my friends and, people I loved ended up going to Afghanistan. And, going through all of that, but also as an organizer. And so, that speech that you showed in 2010, I had been a part of organizing actions against the Afghanistan war for years prior to that and many years after, and in particular organizing with active duty soldiers against the Afghanistan war. And so for years I was, going on to army bases and doing outreach to meet soldiers who were opposed to the Afghanistan war and were getting deployed, who didn't want to go, working with family members whose loved ones had been to Afghanistan and came home and killed themselves. And so like this kind of really intimately involved with the war throughout the duration and kind of seen it at every point from the very beginning up until, what we just saw Biden do. And it's been a lot of twists and turns. And I think that it's, what we just saw was an end of the war that should have never started. And, when I give that speech in 2010, at that point in 2010, the Pentagon, the politicians, they had already acknowledged there's no possible way for us to win this thing. And they spent the next decade or more just trying to make a bunch of money off it to make the best of a lost war, which made a lot of people rich, but killed a lot of more people who didn't have to die in the process.
Do you want to tell people what happened after you gave that speech?
Yeah, I was arrested. And there was probably like over 100 other veterans who were arrested, including Afghanistan veterans. And we were arrested for demonstrating outside the White House where we shouldn't be. That was probably the third time I was arrested demonstrating against the war. But it wasn't just like I was some unique person or individual. I was always arrested with like 100 other veterans. And, like that speech and others of mine, it's been cool that they've become popular, but I was just kind of one of like a mass movement of soldiers at that time. So as soon as the Iraq war started, there was a real upsurge of people in the active duty military who became opposed to the war and then became activists against it. So I'm just like a product of that generation. That's been true. The Vietnam War, pretty much every war the U.S. has fought, there's been a sector of the military that has turned against it. So I'm just one of many who, went through that experience.
Yeah. So I wanted to have you on for obvious reasons today to talk about what's going on in Afghanistan, but I just wanted to give a little bit of background information because there's a lot of new people here. Many people say I'm the gateway to leftist thought. So there's a lot of baby leftists in here. So I just wanted to give a little bit more background. You're an organizer with the PSL as well, right? You are an avowed socialist. Out and about.
Yeah, and actually, that's the funny story. Like, I got out of the army in 2005. I was really mad about the war. I felt really betrayed, lied to, that everything was bullshit that I was told going in, lied to about the Iraq war. And, I came back, really angry. And I didn't realize at the time, but there was like this massive anti-war movement in the streets. And I immediately, that drew me in. So I started organizing like car caravans from Florida to go to Washington, D.C. for these, like the demonstrations were huge, like 100,000 people, 200,000 people would be marching on Washington, marching on the Pentagon to end the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. And, but it wasn't enough for me to like go to the demonstrations. I wanted to like, who's organizing these? And the PSL was one of the groups that I saw being kind of really at the forefront of organizing those actions and mobilizing people with a group called the Answer Coalition. And so that's, that was my gateway in. I felt wasn't enough for me to just show up. I had to try to get other people out. And that kind of defined my life for the next long time.
So you listened to the Joe Biden speech, as we all did, I assume.
Yeah.
What did you think about it overall? Let's get started on that.
I mean, I agree with your reaction that he actually, he held strong. He said, we're going to end the war regardless of the consequences. We're going to get out. And that was good. I mean, it's funny because all of these people that have been like praising Donald Trump when he was in office as like the most anti-imperialist president we ever had. If Donald Trump was still president now and he stood up and gave that speech, there'd all be these headlines. Donald Trump, the anti-imperialist president, the establishment's trying to stop him from ending the war, all this stuff. I'm sure they're not going to be saying that about Biden. But I
think the liberal media, on the other hand, probably still would be mercilessly ripping into Donald Trump in a similar capacity to how they're ripping into Joe Biden right now, saying that like he's horrible and he's personally responsible for everything that's going on in Afghanistan. It's been really surprising seeing that. Not really surprising. Of course, we know that the mainstream media has a massive a boner for warmongering, obviously. But certainly Fox News, you're right, would be talking about how incredible it is that he is, a peaceful dove. And this is his execution, right? I mean, this is, as far as we know, what is going on right now is Joe Biden executing the previous administration's negotiations with the Taliban and the Afghan government.
So, yeah, I mean, that's pretty much right. So I think it's Trump's legacy in Afghanistan is a pretty horrible one. I mean, Trump came into office. The U.S. was already drawing down and had intended to pull out anyway. Like the Pentagon knew it eventually had to get out of Afghanistan. Trump comes into office and he not only like triples the number of U.S. troops. So he's credited with removing troops, but he tripled the number of U.S. troops there. U.S. deaths and Afghan deaths started skyrocketing. And Trump actually presided over the most number of civilian casualties 2 years in a row than any other previous year of the war, which is saying a lot. More than the Obama troop surge when like 140,000 U.S. troops alone, plus NATO, plus mercenaries were flooded through the country. Trump managed to, with his loosening of like restrictions on airstrikes and so forth, just massacred massive numbers of civilians under his tenure. And so to any kind of anti-war cred that Trump gets for negotiating this deal with the Taliban is kind of wiped away by the huge civilian toll that he took. But the war was lost for a long time. And so, yes, Trump negotiated this, peaceful exit of the United States with the Taliban. And, as Biden said in his speech, he said, if we were not gone by May 1st, we'd have to re-engage in Afghanistan. That was an admission of defeat. Because, the Taliban gave a warning to the U.S. after Trump left office. They said, if you're not out by May 1st, we're going to start triggering mass casualty events for U.S. soldiers. So the U.S. knew that they didn't have the capability to fight that. They had long been defeated by the Taliban on the battlefield. So they knew that they really had to get out. And so I think the interesting thing about Biden's speech is because he's acting like he just came in and inherited this war. I mean, he's been a supporter of the Afghanistan war since the very beginning. He said in his speech even, I was against the troop surge. That's kind of disingenuous. Yes, he was against the troop surge of 70,000 additional troops, but he advocated sending just 20 or 30,000 additional troops, so just a smaller surge, and has never advocated for the full withdrawal of Afghanistan. Even when he was campaigning against Trump, said we need to leave 3,000 or 4,000 troops because we can't abandon the Afghan government. And so I think the important thing for everyone to understand is we never should have been in Afghanistan to begin with. You talked on your stream prior to the Biden speech. You gave a really good report about that. There's no reason to. There's no to get revenge for 9/11, get Al Qaeda, whatever. There's no reason for the U.S. to invade. But let's just look at from the military standpoint. The U.S. had been defeated, knew it had been totally defeated militarily by the Taliban in 2010, 2011. When Obama did this troop surge, he gave the whole rationale. We can win, but we have to beat back the Taliban and then create a stable Afghan government. That completely failed. It completely went up in smoke. If you want, we can talk a little about how badly the U.S. was actually defeated. I don't think people really can grasp how on the ground it was just a total military defeat at the hands of the Taliban insurgency. But they knew in 2010, 2011, they knew that there was no military victory against the Taliban. Even with all that huge surge of 100,000 American troops, they could make zero gains against the Taliban forces. So all this talk that Biden was giving about how many more will die in a war that we can't win, well, they could have. So what was the last 10 years been? The last 10 years has literally been everyone in the Pentagon, the generals, and everyone in Washington. They all knew this, that there is no possible way to win on the ground, and the Afghan military had no capabilities to prevent a Taliban takeover when we leave. They've known that for over a decade. But they figured, well, this is really good for the military because we have all this extra money that we can just dump into developing new weapons, new machinery, all types of expanding our arsenal. And all of that money just goes to defense contractors, to oil companies, all the different war profiteers that make up, the bulk of the big industries in this country. They were all just making a killing off of getting, as I mentioned in that speech, $700 million, $800 million a day of U.S. tax dollars just going straight into the war industry. So the politicians in Washington, they're not dying in Afghanistan. They're not getting their legs blown off in Afghanistan. What the hell do they care? The generals in the Pentagon, the Afghanistan war is good for them. They get to put on a medal every time they go to Afghanistan. They get awards for valor for just sitting back on these bases and not watching dots on the map of their soldiers going and getting killed in random remote valleys that mean absolutely nothing to them. And so it's good for their careers. And then they get out of the military and they go right into jobs on the board of director for defense contractors with all of their war battle-tested experience that they got in Afghanistan. So for the elites, for the Pentagon officers, the Pentagon brass, and for the politicians in Washington, all of their friends in the defense contractor industries, the Afghanistan war was fine. It didn't matter that, a few dozen soldiers were dying every year. They don't care. It's not their families. And so they thought, well, we've obviously lost the war. Let's just keep dragging it out. And maybe somewhere down the line, they knew they were eventually going to leave. And there's been a retreat since 2011. The U.S. has been retreating, but in slow motion. So every year the troop numbers dropped. Every year we restricted back to smaller and smaller areas. The U.S. empire knew it eventually had to leave because it looks pretty bad for the world's most powerful empire to be being defeated on the ground by an insurgency using rifles from 100 years ago. So they knew that eventually they had to get out of the quagmire because it's just doesn't look good for you as an empire. But they figured, there's no rush. We'll make a bunch of money on the way out. We'll build up our military a lot on the way out, and then we'll be ready to turn towards some other target once we fully leave.
Yeah, there is a lot of, for people who don't know this, Afghanistan is ripe with minerals, a lot of natural resources that the American military and other contractors that are American usually were able to extract. That was a fundamental reason for why they stayed for as long as they did, while also, I guess, in some capacity, training the Afghan military forces that, of course, immediately got rolled over by the Taliban. And I personally suspect that, and maybe I'm wrong about this, but I talked about this earlier. I don't know if you agree with me on it or not, but I personally think that this was a situation where they were like, look, we are going to get the trillions of dollars of minerals regardless. We might as well do the same contracts with the Taliban so there's actually some stability, and then we can send in, Blackwater or Academy into Afghanistan instead of the American military directly being involved there and doing it themselves. And I thought that, this would be regional stability for everyone if the Taliban were the people that the American government was dealing with, rather than the Afghan government that was never going to be able to push back on the Taliban if they decided to take violent means and kill a bunch of people and eventually and inevitably overtake the government regardless.
No, you're absolutely right. And the U.S. government was trying to negotiate with the Taliban right when they took over through the 90s under Bill Clinton. And they were negotiating because they wanted to build an oil pipeline in Afghanistan. I mean, Afghanistan is an extremely important geopolitical location for resources, neighboring all these oil-rich former Soviet republics. And so the Clinton administration was fine with the Taliban. I mean, there was even groups of Taliban that were flown to Texas to go to the Unocal oil executives' ranch to have meetings about developing these oil pipelines. So the U.S. never had a problem with the Taliban government. But they were just kind of difficult to deal with. They wanted to develop these pipelines, but the Taliban were dragging their feet. They didn't really care about it. And so they were just they weren't the best business partner. And so 9/11, and we can't just look at it in the vacuum of Afghanistan. When 9/11 happened, the United States government said, great, this is perfect. Every government in the region that is not a total client or neo-colony of the United States, now's our ticket to go take them all out. Why did they want to take out the Taliban government? Not because the Taliban had anything to do with 9/11, which they didn't. Not because they weren't cooperating with the U.S. in anti-terrorism operations. They were. The Taliban were just annoying to deal with as business partners. So they figured, we'll just go in Afghanistan, knock down the Taliban real quick, set up a puppet government that's a neo-colony of the United States and will give us all the contracts to mine the minerals and build the oil pipeline. Then we'll go to Iraq and take down that government really easily and then set up a puppet government that'll give us all the oil contracts. Then we'll go to Iran and do the same thing. Syria do the same thing. Lebanon do the same thing. Sudan do the same thing. Somalia do the same thing. I mean, and a lot of those countries Biden named in his speech of places we need to turn towards, not being bogged down in Afghanistan. So that was the goal of the U.S. empire and imperialism in the wake of 9/11, was go to this region, which was like a bastion of anti-imperialism and resistance to U.S. domination, and just this total imperial arrogance to think that they could just go in and easily overthrow these governments and install puppet governments, and then it would just go very easily. And it just shows you just the hubris and the arrogance of the people in Washington and the Pentagon who have so much control over our lives. They're complete idiots. And so it both blew up in their faces. The Iraq War completely blew up in their face. They were totally defeated militarily on the ground and effectively retreated in defeat. And the same thing happened in Afghanistan. But Afghanistan's a little different because they were able to drag it out a lot longer. And it's the same thing with Vietnam. After the U.S. knew they had lost in Vietnam, militarily anyway, of course, still is a lot to gain for the war industry. But instead of just saying, okay, there's no possible way to achieve our objectives, we don't want to kill any more people and we don't want any more our people to die, they adopted a strategy called peace with honor, which meant just bombing, killing millions extra people and sending 100,000 or so more soldiers to their deaths before they eventually retreated. And that's what happened in Afghanistan. I mean, there is no reason why they couldn't have left a decade ago. And I remember when Obama, it should have never been there. Leaving a decade ago would have been very popular. I remember when Obama gave his speech announcing the troop surge at West Point and everything. And I was gathered with a bunch of military families, mostly mothers, and whose whose sons were in the military, had been to Afghanistan 4 or 5 times, been to Iraq a bunch of times, and thinking that Obama was going to end the war. And Obama's speech actually turned into, we're escalating the war, but then we're going to end it in 3 years. And by 2014, it'll be over. And it was just this room of all these moms just like sobbing, knowing that they were like so tired. They're done. And here was Obama saying, you got to just stick through it another 4 years, just another 4 years, and then we'll really end the war. And the main rationale, Obama said, we can't leave now. We have to keep sacrificing lives because we can't let the Taliban take over. Now it's like the main reason. We cannot let the Taliban take over, and that's the only rationale to continue fighting. Well, they knew that there was no stopping that. They knew that that wasn't a possibility to defeat the Taliban, but they just lied and kept it going. And I think the Afghanistan papers, which were released in 2019, blows the lid off the whole thing. And for some reason, it implicates Biden. For some reason, it wasn't a big issue in the election campaign. He got asked like one question about it in one of the primary debates. But just what the Afghanistan papers did was showed that the Pentagon, all the commanders in Afghanistan, were saying to the White House, by every metric, we have lost the war and have no possibility of turning it around. And so the Obama administration, the White House, turned back to them and said, well, if we're losing by every metric, create a metric that shows that we're succeeding. And so there's this directive given to just create these kind of fake examples of how, actually there's hope to be had in the Afghanistan war. The people shouldn't turn against it just another couple years and we can turn this around. And it just says everything about the American government. They knew that it was hopeless, but they just kept lying to the people who were having to send their sons and daughters to die and be killed, or kill other people. Kept dropping bombs on poor families in Afghanistan for a mission that they knew they couldn't accomplish. And the whole time, really, they were just like, well, if we kill enough people, then maybe the Taliban will give all these concessions when we leave and allow us to form a unity government where our puppet forces have 50% of the government. So everyone who died in Afghanistan, everyone who died in the U.S. military, it was all just to pressure the Taliban into giving some concessions. And so it's kind of shows that you just can never trust these people.
But there was absolutely zero reason, right? I mean, there was no reason for the Taliban to ever give concessions because they could just wait it out. They already dominated areas outside of Kabul regardless. And even in some instances, they were seen as liberators in areas outside of Kabul regardless, historically. So they already had, all they needed to do was lay back and sit back and wait for the inevitable attrition to get to a point where the American military simply cannot continue occupying Afghanistan. And it did literally happen. That's where we're at now.
No, that's absolutely right. And the Pentagon has known that the whole time. I mean, just an example of how bad the war was lost. I mean, when the troop surge era, when they just sent, it's one thing, casualties are low when the U.S. forces just hold up on these massive bases in Kabul and Bagram and other places where it's very fortified. It's hard to, you can shoot some rockets in there, but even that's hard because it's just all open land ahead of it that's patrolled by drones and everything. But when the U.S. sent its military out to all of these outposts all over the countryside of Afghanistan, I mean, I have a lot of friends who went through this and who were there. I mean, you're talking about, 40 U.S. troops just sent on a hilltop in the middle of the countryside in Afghanistan. And every day, your normal routine would be you'd go on a patrol through the village and through the farmland. The patrol had no purpose other than to say, hey, we're here patrolling. And that's what you do when you've won a war. Just so some generals back in Kabul in the command center could point at a map and say, oh, yeah, look where our soldiers are. We're winning the war. Every time you'd go on a patrol, you'd just be getting shot at from people you couldn't even see. We're 1,000 meters away, just taking pot shots at you and shooting a bunch of your guys. Nothing to shoot back at because you don't even know where they are. On your way back after getting shot at for a few hours and being pinned down in the middle of a grape field or something, someone gets blown up by an IED because the Taliban knows exactly where you're going to walk. During the troop surge, the wounds to genitalia of soldiers increased 95%. That became the number one wound for soldiers was just getting your shit blown off. But then the signature wound really became triple amputees. So 2 legs and an arm became the characteristic wound of just these totally pointless patrols, just going out just for the sake of walking out. So then you go on this patrol every day where someone gets shot, someone gets killed, someone gets their legs blown off. Then you go back to the base and then spend the night under total assault by sometimes you'd have 500 Taliban fighters assaulting a base with 40 US soldiers on it, and almost in a lot of cases actually like overrunning the base, like getting over the wire and having to be killed, Taliban being killed inside the actual American base. And the only thing that prevented just all the bases from being wiped out is the job of US soldiers was just to be basically bait, to be sitting ducks, to draw Taliban attack, and just stay alive long enough for air support to get there. So once you start getting attacked, you call in the Apaches, you call in the B-52s to just lay waste to the villages and everything that's all around it. And so it's just a completely insane situation. It made absolutely no sense from like a military strategy point of view. The generals knew that it was just completely pointless, but you know what? Every time their soldiers got shot at, you had a major, you had a lieutenant colonel, you had a colonel getting a little award for valor, even though they weren't in the battle, so it was fine for them. And that just proved to be a totally pointless thing. And so after the surge, after this putting out these soldiers as bait everywhere in the middle of nowhere, they eventually said, okay, we'll pull back, and then we'll just bomb everything to try to exert some kind of pressure. So it's just, I mean, the essence of the war is just a bunch of senseless killing for a mission that they knew was completely hopeless, but they figured, you know what? It's good for our military, it's good for our war economy. So, and there's not a lot of opposition, a lot of pressure for us to end it, so why bother? Let's just keep it going as long as we feel we can.
And then there was also the abysmal failure that I talked about for 4 hours yesterday with respect to our training program of the Afghan security forces, where officers were told by high command to turn the other cheek or look the other way when the routine raping of little kids was happening by the Afghan security forces that we were training. So I do find it additionally laughable when liberal warmongers turn around and say things like, well, what about the women that we were defending when we were out there? When it's like, okay, I mean, the Taliban are brutal. Don't get me wrong. Do not misunderstand me. They are a fundamentalist, a brutal group of militants that are still, in every sense of the word, not demonstrating the will of the Afghan people, even though they are demonstrating it more than having an American puppet state installed, certainly. But the training program overall was a disaster. The government was a disaster. We spent $90 billion on that training alone, and only for them to roll over and completely drop their arms, which are now in the hands of the Taliban, by the way, over the course of a week and of the final 72 hours. So I have a question for you. What do you say to the people who want to continue that? What do you say to the people that want to extend the senseless brutality that we subjected the Afghan civilians to, and also the American military members to? What do you have to say to liberal media? Should we just airdrop every single person that has talked about how much they need to be there, how much we need to have permanent occupation? That's what I'm thinking. Send fucking every DC wonk consultant that thinks it's a good idea to continue, defending the women of Afghanistan. Just send them out there. Let them, sit on a fucking forward operating base in the middle of Karengal Valley, getting shot at from all directions.
Yeah, I mean, that's probably a good solution from the beginning of the war. I mean, all the strongest advocates are people. It's easy to advocate for it because you're safe in Washington, D.C. And also, not only that, but you're in such an elite world that you don't have any friends or family members that are being sent to go get killed. I mean, it's funny, the women's rights thing, because I'm wondering, do people think that there were women's rights being advanced anywhere in Afghanistan outside of the American green zone in Kabul? I mean, areas that were under U.S. control, U.S. occupation, there was no change in the religious fundamental nature of what was going on there. It was, and I think people that can imagine that the U.S. military is kind of any kind of force for good or stability in the world. I mean, the most number of civilians, yes, there's a lot of civilians killed in fighting between the U.S. and the Taliban that you could attribute to the Taliban killing, even though it's fighting from a war imposed by the United States. But the majority of civilians are killed by U.S. airstrikes. I mean, to say that the top killer of civilians in Afghanistan, and we're not talking just a few here and there. I mean, I think everyone was following the horror in Gaza, the Israeli siege on Gaza that happened just a few months ago. And it was horrifying because there were families sleeping in their homes, have an Israeli bomb dropped on it, and the entire family is wiped out. I mean, that was a daily occurrence in Afghanistan. It's very important that the Gaza got so much coverage, but there's almost this complete disconnect with the American public and the American media with the kind of things that are being done with our tax dollars in our military. I mean, I don't think people would think that, oh, like every other day, the U.S. is dropping a bomb that lands on a house and kills 12 people of the same family, wipes out 3 generations in one airstrike. I mean, that was a typical occurrence by the U.S. military. And, you know, like you mentioned the raping kids, the Afghan forces, the U.S. forces were killing kids. I mean, the CIA in Afghanistan running these death squads, they actually did a couple operations where they went to religious schools, took all these young boys, some as young as like 9 years old, and shot them all in the head, executed them as like a form of terrorism to try to dissuade people from going to these religious schools, because one day they could become members of the Taliban if they go to this religious school. So the brutality and the violence of the U.S. occupation, which, you know, no one wants to live under occupation. I mean, oh, just because there's like, they advocate like women's rights, the soldiers occupying you, checking you, like patting you down every time you want to go in and out of your house, you know, shooting up your village. They think they're taking fire from it. You know, the risk of like a drone being dropped on your house just because you're in the vicinity of some fighting. I mean, the daily existence of life under a country at war and under foreign occupation is pretty devastating. And so I think that people have the picture in their mind, like the liberals advocating for like, oh, what about the women? It's like, they're really thinking about people in like one small area of Afghanistan that's was a complete fortress by the US and NATO powers, but they don't want to look out. They don't want to look at actually what their government and their military was doing kind of outside that little bubble. And one last thing I'll say about how you said the training operation was like went up in smoke, you know, and how that just allowed these Afghan forces to do a lot of bad stuff. A lot of the civilian deaths and a lot of the war crimes and atrocities were carried out by Afghan forces working in concert with US forces. So like definitely not the like socially progressive beacon of rights that you want to have running and taking over the country. But just to speak to the level of the US defeat there, when the US basically retreated from all the countryside and said, we're just getting our ass kicked out there, there's no reason to be out here, we're just going to go on these bases and just train our proxy forces. Well, US troop deaths went down from IEDs and from being shot, but then the number one killer of US troops became insider killings by the people that they were training. And this huge phenomenon exploded of guys who hated the US just joining the Afghan army. And then a week later, they got an AK on a gun range and they just turn around and shoot the guys that are training them. And so from every angle, the US just completely failed militarily. I mean, they couldn't even say, oh, we're just going to train these soldiers to do the dirty work for us. Then those soldiers started killing them. So it's like a complete disaster.
Yeah, we were watching This Is What Winning Looks Like yesterday, where one of the officers literally was like, we always have to have a gun trained on some of the Afghan forces that we are currently in the process of training, because you don't know who's going to turn around. And I guess, what's the military term for it? Blue Falcon? But I guess not even in that situation, I guess. Like, just turn around and just start fucking, you know, shooting our guys. Guardian Angel.
Right. Yeah, I mean, and sometimes like they'd escape. Like there's this one photo, it'd probably be hard to find now, but there's like this young kid. This kid's probably like 16. He wasn't even a Taliban guy. He was just like, I fucking hate the United States. Like most people do. When you're under foreign occupation, you typically hate the foreign occupiers. It's like kind of a universal human thing. You know, like
I don't know what you're talking about. It's crazy. Wait, they welcomed us as liberators, I thought.
It's like, and it's right. I mean, but that's the U.S. policy. Oh, they're actually going to like us. But there's this kid who was like 16, hated the U.S. He joined the Afghan army. He killed like 2 U.S. soldiers in training, and then somehow got off the base. And there's a photo of him being like carried on the shoulders of everyone in the village right outside the base. And he's like, I did it. I got the Americans. And then he just like went on with his life. I mean, who knows what happened to him now? But like that's like the sentiment there. I mean, obviously there's people who like don't like the Taliban and are scared about what's going to happen. I think it's actually interesting that the Taliban have very clearly decided that they're pursuing a policy of like international credibility. So I don't know if you noticed, but like when they took all these major cities, there really wasn't fighting. Like the Afghan military just folded because like they just really don't care. Like in Kabul, there wasn't a shot fired when the Taliban came and took over Kabul.
Well, hold on. There were shots fired last night, Mike, as you also saw, by the American military shooting at people, civilians that they actually ended up murdering, you know, for one last huzzah, for good old time's sake, where they murdered a bunch of civilians that were trying to desperately get onto airplanes and like literally fucking probably get thrown off the airplane inevitably when it takes off. But that's the sense of desperation amongst the civilian population of Kabul that the American military was not allowing them to be on the air base or the field. So they ended up shooting 3 people.
Yeah, I mean, I honestly, that's the most, I think, iconic images of the end of the Afghan. I mean, everyone's showing like the Chinook helicopter lifting off the roof like it was in Saigon, or the plane on the tarmac with all the people mobbing it. I think the most emblematic images we're seeing is of the soldiers shooting at civilians who are on the tarmac trying to escape. I mean, just until the very last moment, really embodying what the entire war has been. Just a horrible, and it's like, obviously the civilians are on your side. They're there trying to like escape the Taliban, but just total dehumanization and lack of care for the people of the country, and just kind of the readiness to use violence. But no shot was fired by the Taliban or by Afghan military resisting them. Most of the big cities that fell to the Taliban, there wasn't a shot fired, or there's almost no fighting. But the Taliban have announced, since they announced the new government, that they would allow safe passage to anyone who's leaving Afghanistan. So no one has to worry about, running to the planes as they're taking off. They're like, we're going to let you leave. They've said that they are going to honor their commitment to the United States to make sure that nobody is able to plan a terrorist attack against the United States from Afghan soil. They've even said, of course, the Taliban could just take over the entire government. The Taliban has said, we're going to allow figures from the previous puppet regime to be in the government. It's not just going to be all Taliban people. And they've even said that they're going to adopt more moderate policies. So the Taliban that you saw in power in the 90s, they're not going to do that again. And they're going to let women go to school and things like that.
I don't believe that, for the record.
I definitely don't. I agree with you, but they obviously are taking an approach to kind of have some kind of international credibility, to try to be seen as a legitimate government on the world stage after coming out of just, such a long protracted war. And so I think the reason I say that is because you could really quickly see the U.S. narrative turn around, where they start saying, actually, you know what? This shows that we won in Afghanistan because the Taliban aren't as bad, and it's because of us, and we succeeded in this or that, and then start doing business deals with them again like they wanted to in the 90s.
Yeah, I can absolutely see them like rolling out the red carpet on the Atlantic for like the mullah that now took over and is like going to be the new president, in the same way that they do with like MBS when he did his original like charm
New
offensive.
moderate.
And everyone was like, oh my God, look how great the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia is now. They're letting women drive. Meanwhile, like the women that advocated for that were still being tortured in fucking prison. You know what I mean? Only recently released, by the way. So I can totally see that. And I do agree with you on that. And I do believe that that's what's going on. I think that there is going to be an effort to normalize the Taliban rule in government. We're going to look the other way. Right now, we're hyper-focused on it. There's going to be an era where we look the other way, where the Taliban does whatever the fuck they want to do, ultimately to turn around and say, look, they're actually doing a great job. We won after all. We normalized and we made the Taliban progressive because, like I said, they're just going to be getting their contracts from the Taliban until they decide to no longer comply with the United States interests. And the other reason why I feel that way is because I'm seeing, I mean, you saw Dostum. I'm sure you're familiar with this person, who is like Turkey's guy, basically, in the fight, who is a mercenary warlord, brutal dude, first vice president of Afghanistan, right? I think one of the that has been living in Turkey since 2009, originally come back to Afghanistan, and then only to immediately take his forces and leave for Uzbekistan. And that, to me, signals that, like, all of the regional leaders, including India, which the Taliban is making efforts to normalize relationships with, are functionally saying, like, we are the new guys in charge. We are going to just, implement Sharia law, of course, the will of Allah. But having said that, we are going to, we're not going to be doing the same stuff that we were doing back in the good old days of our occupation. So who knows? But seeing what, like, the deals that Russia clearly also struck with the Taliban, considering that their embassy, if I'm not mistaken, is completely untouched at this moment, seeing that not a single a single shot has been fired thus far, and overtaking even Kabul, which was, the tactical stronghold of the United States, the Green Zone, as you said. I feel as though their ultimate goals are to be the next administration in Afghanistan.
Yeah, and the U.S. is fine with that. In fact, they've been fine with the Taliban government since the troop surge. I mean, they knew then that there was no way to completely defeat the Taliban. They knew that it was either the Taliban totally takes over, or there's some kind of unity government where our puppets get some seats. And so all of it, this whole time of all this rhetoric of we have to defeat the Taliban, we have to keep fighting to defeat the Taliban, they were just bullshitting. They knew that they were never going to defeat them. They knew that they were never going to keep them from power. It was just a question of how much power would they have in relation to the U.S. puppet forces. But the U.S. is also, I mean, the only reason they're leaving is because they're actually fine with the Taliban government if it kind of collaborates and cooperates in certain ways with the U.S. And Biden in that speech basically issued a threat saying if they don't cooperate, we can go back to just bombing them. So of course there's still going to be drones flying over, B-52 bombers whenever they feel like it. You know, the U.S. reserves the right to kill people in the world whenever it wants to for whatever reason, and that's kind of unquestioned. But they'll still be exerting pressure in that way if they're not getting what they want from the Taliban. But there's an important reason why the U.S. left Afghanistan. And it's the same reason why they drew down drastically in Iraq prior to the re-engagement in the war to defeat ISIS, but now they're drawing down again. And people remember when Obama came into office, he came in on all this rhetoric against the Iraq war. You know, this is the dumb war, Afghanistan is a smart war, but he also never said we should be in Afghanistan indefinitely. In fact, his policy for Afghanistan was to try to win the war quickly so we could leave because of something he called the Asia pivot. And I think people have heard that term, the Asia pivot, the pivot towards China, but pivot away from what? And it was the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And the Obama administration and the Pentagon leaders at that time were arguing it's really bad for the empire that we are bogged down in two unwinnable wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, even though we're making some money there and even though it's helping us bolster our military and all the other benefits that come from a never-ending war, but we are failing to direct our forces toward our next enemies. China, Russia, of course, countries in Latin America the U.S. wants to overthrow. And so there's all these other targets, and it's hard for imperialism to effectively overthrow and engage these other targets for regime change that they have if they're bogged down, looking pretty bad in two disastrous wars that were supposed to be like the 9/11 revenge wars that makes the U.S. look good and strong in the world.
Even though there's nothing to do, especially in Iraq, with respect to 9/11, even remotely related, obviously, and also even with Afghanistan, there were multiple different avenues that we could have pursued that did not involve relentless bombing campaigns and also boots on the ground military warfare, or I don't know, giving bags of cash to fucking pedophile warlords that we shipped into Afghanistan into certain areas if the other warlord of the region was not complying with our demands to turn the other cheek or tell us about Taliban's movements every now and then.
Yeah, and all of that, all the trillions of dollars that were spent in Afghanistan, the money that didn't go into like war profiteers in the U.S. were just like stolen by all the U.S. proxy forces, all the warlords, like basically just took that money and pocketed it, which is another reason why the Afghan military collapsed, because a lot of that money was just stolen by them. But, you know, I think there's like a lot of people were surprised that the war actually ended for that reason. It's like, well, there's so much money to be made in forever wars. There's so many minerals there that we don't want to give up and so forth. But like the imperialist state, the job of the Pentagon, the job of the government under a capitalist imperialist system is to manage the common affairs of the ruling class, the common interests of the ruling class. And so, yes, there were certain industries that probably lost out with the U.S. leaving Iraq and Afghanistan. You know, the people making all the bombs that are getting dropped, you know, the fuel companies that are providing all the fuel for the Apaches to fly over the country, you know, 24 hours a day. So, of course, there's some industries that are taking a hit, but the head of the empire said, it's better for our common interests as a collective ruling class, as the capitalist class as a whole, if we slow down these wars and direct towards other enemies that we want to conquer, that we want to take over, that we want to overthrow. And so the whatever credit Biden can get for ending the war, which, you know, Trump could have done it, but he chose not to because he chickened out. He could have ended it on his watch and been the president who ended the war as he promised in his campaigning, but he chickened out. So Biden does, I guess, get credit for actually having the guts to be like, it's gonna be bad press, but I'm gonna take the fall. But the motives are not because it was wrong to have people dying in Afghanistan, people to be occupied. It was wrong to keep sending soldiers to have their legs blown off, but because they want to turn towards other targets for overthrow. And that's just that's the nature of imperialism. And that's how you can kind of rationalize why the U.S. would give up such a prize. Afghanistan was a huge prize. I mean, the U.S.'s main goals was to overthrow the government, develop it as a neo-colony, have unfettered access to its resources, and have military bases. The U.S. loves to have military bases in every country that it can, especially in Afghanistan. Being so close to China, India, former Soviet republics, it is a massive prize that the U.S. lost. It did not achieve those core objectives. And so why would they do that? Well, because it's more important for them to turn in other directions to overthrow, which, at its core, it's completely rotten and criminal.
What do you think will happen next in Afghanistan? Like, what's your speculation, if you choose to speculate on it? And how do the people of Afghanistan liberate themselves? I mean, we didn't even offer historical context to this, but like, obviously, part of the reason why the Taliban is so strong, or was so strong originally, is because of the Mujahideen forces that were trained and also offered weapons by the United States government under Reagan as a counterweight towards the USSR and their interest in the region. Like, clearly, some of those people branched off, became the Taliban. Some of those people became Al Qaeda. Some of those people actually fought the Taliban. Obviously, it's very complex. There's like different warring tribes that have always worked there. But what we do know is that any sort of socialist, any sort of leftist momentum was completely squashed in a way that we see all around the world, led by Western imperialist forces, or led by Israel in the case of Hamas, because a lot of these reactionary forces are often seen as a counterbalance, a counterweight towards any sort of like socialist organizing, any sort of socialist militia, which is the true enemy, and that's the genuinely fearful organization, even if it's the people's actual will. So right now there isn't necessarily, as far as I've seen, there isn't necessarily like any sort of momentum against the Taliban, and I don't even know if there ever can be one. What do you see for the future of Afghanistan?
You're right. I mean, Afghanistan was becoming increasingly socially progressive. It had a vibrant socialist movement, which took power in the Sour Revolution in the 70s, which, of course, the U.S. did everything it could to destroy. And just like you mentioned, like in Iran, like in Lebanon, like in Palestine, the kind of focus on nationalist forces gives a space to more religious forces to ascend, and then they end up dealing with those religious forces. But I think it brings together, this point about, can a U.S. humanitarian intervention exist? Like, anytime you have when a country is under a foreign occupation and in a war, in every sense, every single person who lived in Afghanistan, their daily reality was war. That becomes the main contradiction in a society. And so how can you think about social progress, or building social progress, or socialist or left-wing organizations forming and fighting for more rights and presenting a left-wing alternative or challenge to the religious forces in the country, when you're in a state of war, when you're under occupation? That becomes just the last thing on the list on people's minds. It becomes impossible to actually do it. And so, yes, of course we want to see Afghanistan progress into what is in its roots. I mean, it is in Afghanistan's very recent history to be pushing towards extreme levels of social progress, rights movement, all that stuff. That's in Afghanistan's history and blood. That wasn't brought from any other country. That was organic to Afghanistan and some people's lifetimes who may be watching this. It wasn't that long ago. But of course, that is completely hindered and blocked by being in a state of war. And so now, with the full withdrawal of U.S. and NATO forces, now Afghanistan can start on that path of moving in that direction. Now opens up new space for people to fight for what's right and to bring society to a different place. And that's true anywhere. As long as you're in the state of attack by the United States or imperialist powers, of course that's going to slow any kind of other progress. And another thing I think is going to happen is what always happens is the U.S. is going to try to rewrite the history of the Afghanistan war. And that's why it's important that you're doing this stream. You've done coverage of this. It's like when Obama ended the war in Iraq, he declared this new holiday, I think called Freedom Day, which is to mark the end of the Iraq war, and gave this whole narrative about what the Iraq war really was. We freed the Iraqi people, we gave them a better life, whatever. And it's just a complete disgusting rewrite of history. They did the same thing with Vietnam, with Korea, with all their wars. They like to rewrite the history. And so now that the chapter is closed on Afghanistan, you're going to see Washington, the media, start writing a new narrative of what the war was about, what we did, what we accomplished, all of that stuff. And one thing they're going to leave out of that narrative is that there was a vibrant movement against it, even though it was small at times the entire way, including from people in the military who are resisting the war, refusing orders, and things like that.
All right. Well, dude, thank you so much for coming on. Do you have any other final parting words? I don't want to take up more of your time. This was incredible.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate you having me on.
Did you ever think that you would be? Did you ever think that you would, as a socialist, as an open socialist, be one of the top broadcasted streams on any platform whatsoever, and be able to say stuff like that?
Optimism, man. The reason for my optimism, man, is that these politics weren't always accepted, and now they're becoming so popular, and that gives me a lot of hope for the future. Just parting words. I really appreciate you having me on. If people want to learn more, see more of my work, have a show called The Empire Files that's hosted by my partner, Abby Martin. Got a lot of stuff there. And I think that just the thing to keep in mind is that the U.S. isn't done. I mean, just like after Vietnam, the U.S. was humiliated in Vietnam, left in a humiliating, embarrassing retreat. But that didn't mean the empire was falling and crumbled and was slowed down. It just turned its sights towards Latin America and started sponsoring all of these horrible, dirty wars and regime change in Latin America, turned towards the Middle East. So what you're seeing in the media now, the establishment, the ruling class, the elites, they're very upset that they're being embarrassed right now. That's why Biden is under so much pressure. I mean, they thought they were going to be getting all this glory for ending the war. That's why Biden is planning this 9/11 celebration to honor his ending the forever war. Kamala Harris back in April leaked to the press that actually I'm the one that helped convince Biden to pull out because they all thought it was going to go well. Now that it's looking bad for them, the establishment is really upset that the empire looks bad right now. It is not good for U.S. imperialism to be seen on the world stage as suffering such a major defeat. And what is the only remedy for that? It's having a victory somewhere else. It's having an achievement, rolling back some other government they don't like in another country. So I think people who care about peace, about self-determination, about international solidarity, is we have to be vigilant and knowing that the empire is not going to take a break after getting its ass kicked and losing in Afghanistan. It's going to be turning towards other countries that they want to overthrow for no other reason than profits and hegemony for the U.S. empire.
So you're saying Africa, here we come. I mean, we're
already building
there.
up. Already started.
We're already there.
Even Biden said it in his speech. He even mentioned Somalia in his speech, meaning that they want to escalate stuff there. So from Latin America to Africa to other countries in the Middle East, especially in Asia, the United States is going to continue to be on the warpath, and we can present a real challenge when there's opportunities to take action in the streets, and also kind of just building this consciousness, anti-imperialist consciousness, with everyone we know and everyone that we can influence.
All right. Well, thanks for all the incredible work that you do, and I'll hopefully you'll come back soon.
Oh yeah, man, anytime.
All right. Folks,
all right, later.
That was Mike Preisner. He is brilliant. His work is great, alongside his partner Abby Martin, and I was very fortunate to be able to have him on. I hope you guys learned a thing or two. One of my favorite things that I hear from chat whenever I do stuff like this is people being like, dude, what a keyboard warrior. What does he know? It's like, well, I mean, I think he knows a lot. He was personally invested and has a lot of personal experience as well. So everyone can suck one whenever they say like, oh, dude, you fucking hate veterans. You fucking hate veterans. Yeah, guess what, bitch? There you go. I had a veteran on, and I have plenty of veterans in my community as well. Hopefully that was an informative segment. I am about to pee my pants. That was another reason why I needed to, end the interview as quickly as I possibly could. But he was fucking awesome. Mike was awesome. Like I said, you can check out his work at Empire Files alongside Abby Martin. Abby was also on the Joe Rogan show recently. Joe is still a fan of Abby Martin. And I'm going to run an ad really quickly, but here you're going to see some additional details on the latest developments in Afghanistan while I go pee. Hopefully there isn't anything like crazy on here. I don't know if they show like the people falling off the plane. Oh, they do. Okay. Yeah, I'm going to show you guys I'll start off with this one. I'm going to run an ad break right now because I have to. Top of the hour, and it's time for a 60-second ad break. Okay. We'll get back to, you know what? We'll get back to Michael Pompeo and what he had to say about his involvement. And of course, if you no longer want to see the ads, all you need to do is subscribe. You can do it for $5 or for free. The coverage is continuing. You can subscribe for free with a Twitch Prime if you have one, if you have an Amazon Prime account, or you can subscribe, or you can use an ad block or a VPN, but Twitch Prime is free. Here's the 1 minute ad break now. Here's the video.
To that piece of paper, to the words that they had put on the ground. We weren't going to allow them to just walk away from any deal that they'd struck. We were going to go crush them. We were going to go impose real costs on them. We weren't going to let them take these provincial capitals. They understood that American power was going to come to their village, to their community, to the friends and family around them, and we were going to make sure that they understood America wasn't going to allow Americans to be killed from this place. We didn't take the word of the Taliban. We watched their actions on the ground when they did the right thing and they helped us against terror. That was all good. And when they didn't, we crushed them.
Finally, and I've got about 2 minutes here, sir. You graduated first in your class.